It was on this very same day, approximately 3,500 years ago, that an incredible event happened. An incredible event happened on this holy day of God, the last day of unleavened bread. And then, in another 40 years from that, another incredible event happened. And both of those we're going to look at today help us to understand what the meaning of today is, what God wants us to get out of this in particular holy day. So, if we recall in this week, during these days of unleavened bread, that the nation of Israel was called out of Egypt. Okay, the Passover happened. Now they were no longer to be a slave to sin or the sinful ways, which again Egypt represented, as well as Pharaoh. This is a time of the year when we're to remove leaven from our home and purge the sin from our life. And so it's symbolic of these things, just as this last day is, as well as the time leading up to this day. So it started with Passover. It started with them coming out of Egypt, but that's not it. That's not all there is to it. That's just the beginning. We have 7 days total with this holy day at the end. Let's turn back to Exodus 12. Exodus 12, beginning in verse 2. And we're going to go through this chapter fairly quickly, hitting on some of the highlights there. But by way of review, we're going to look at what led up to this and then what happened after this, what transpired in that next and upcoming week. And what is it then that we see, and what is it that we are to learn from this? So hopefully you start putting these things together in your own mind, and even if you get ahead of me, then that's great, and that's fine. Exodus 12 and verse 2 and 3. It says, again, this shall be the beginning of your months. This is the first month. So he's defining it for them. They had been in slavery for over 2 centuries, I believe. And now God was revealing, re-revealing, as it were, the days as it was to be kept in the Hebrew calendar. And then he says in verse 3, on the 10th of this month, everyone was to take a lamb. So you're supposed to get the lamb ready for the Passover. This was going to be the Passover lamb later. Verse 6, it says, keep it until the 14th day of this same month, the first month. And then they were going to kill it at twilight. Then verse 7, they were to take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel. All right. If this was then to be done, then we find out what happened in verse 13. Cause and effect. If they put the blood there, then when God would see the blood, he would pass over them, and the plague would not come on them and strike them. Of course, that was the death of the firstborn of not only the humans or the family members, but also their beasts, the animals that they had. So verse 14, we understand then that this was to be kept, this Passover and the feast days, were to be kept as a feast to the Lord throughout their generations as an everlasting ordinance. Verse 14. And then verse 15, we see this, what can be considered a peculiar request. But once we understand why God did this, and this is the way God always is, God has a reason for everything that he does. Right? Just because we don't understand doesn't mean that it doesn't mean anything or that it's silly. But many of these things can be life and death, or they can be salvational issues if we do not do them, if we do not seek to understand them and to keep them. So he says here in verse 15, 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. So here we are, and we're not going to go through Leviticus 23 today, but there's a listing of all the holy days and feast days that God would have us keep instead of the ones that most keep today. So he says, okay, you're going to do this, and you're going to remove leaven from your home. And we talked about this last week. And he says in verse 16, the first day is going to be a holy convocation. It's going to be a holy day. It's going to be a day that you're to convocate, that you're to come together and to worship God. And we understand that as going to church, right? But this is going to be a special day. No matter what day of the week it does happen to fall on, it's going to be a day that they were to come together, and subsequently we are too. And then also, verse 16, on the seventh day there shall be a holy convocation. So on the first day of unleavened bread, so you have Passover, you have the first day of unleavened bread the next day, and then 7 days later, the last day of unleavened bread, which we are to be celebrating today. So God's giving this to them ahead of time. Okay, so we have this institution of Passover and the days of unleavened bread. He's telling them when it's going to happen because God has a meaning and a purpose for it. And we see some of this in verse 17. He says, "So you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for on this same day I will have brought your armies," meaning the people of Israel, "out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this throughout your generations as an everlasting ordinance." This is what they were to remember. This is what they were to again assign meaning to for this day. We may have watched the Ten Commandments movie and some of this thing, but it's all amazing, all these miracles. But what was the purpose of all of this? I mean, it's a fantastic movie. You go through it and it's incredible and epic. But do they mention, the days of unleavened bread and the things that happened on these days and what was to be remembered? So skipping down to verse 35, it says, okay, "Now the children of Israel had done according to the word of Moses, and they had asked from the Egyptians the articles of silver and gold." So they did the Passover, they did the blood, and then they did this next thing. And what we're seeing here was that there was not a lot asked of them. And what we're going to understand here is that it was not by their own power that they left. It wasn't because they did a whole bunch of things to secure their own release. Now, they had to do a few things, put the blood, they asked, and then they had to kind of get up and walk. And so here we then find in verse 41, "It came to the pass at the end of 430 years on the very same day." I think the King James Version, the Authorized Version, says that same day. So if you went back 430 years, it was on this same day, right, when God was talking to Abraham, it's the same exact day that it is today, that God was planning them to come out of Egypt. And so verse 43, this is the ordinance of Passover. So he said, okay, this is a special day and a special time. And here's what I want you to do. Here's what I want you to remember. And here's how it's supposed to be kept. And here who can keep it. In verse 43, it says, "No foreigner shall eat it." In verse 45, it says, "A sojourner and a hired servant shall not eat of it." Okay, but in verse 44, it tells who can. That is the person who is circumcised. So when they became circumcised, they became a part of the nation of Israel. And it was then fine, or it was okay for them to partake in the days of unleavened bread as well as the Passover. So of course this has even meaning for us today, which we'll get to a little bit later. So the point is, though, it was not by their own might. Okay, what did they do? How is it that they were saved from their present distress? It was by God and what he had done. He'd done the miracles in terms of getting them to this point. And then he was going to continue to do miracles in terms of leading them and guiding them and performing other supernatural feats so that they could escape their bondage. Of course, Christ was that Passover, and we know that. It was the lamb's blood represented him, and this was the start of the process, that it was by him doing these things that they were able to escape Egypt, to escape the land of Egypt, okay, which, again, was a representation of sin. They had to get completely out of it. And this was a lot about what their journey was about. Exodus 13, the next chapter here, it says, "Moses said to the people, 'Remember this day in which you went out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage.'" Right? So they left their captors. They were enslaved. They had to work 7 days a week. They had to make bricks, and they had to make the bricks without straw later on. They had to then be subjugated to whatever the Egyptians wanted, even to the point that the Egyptians put forth their gods with a little g, because there is no other God being, other than the family of God, which is the Father and the Son. So on this day, okay, he is now making them to leave their bondage, their captors. And notice, again, what the point is here. It says, for by strength of hand, in verse 3, the Lord brought you out of this place. Right? They needed to understand that. And again, we're going to talk about that a little bit more and how that applies to us. Again, this is why these things are important and why we're to understand and you can't just throw away the Old Testament and the things of it, because it is full and rich of meaning even for us today and helps paint a more complete and accurate picture for what God is doing. He says, by God's hand you are brought out. No leavened bread shall be eaten. And so in verse 13, we're going to go through this again to understand what it is that God is doing here and the importance of this holy day season, the spring holy day season, which we are in. He says, on this day you're going out, the month of Abib, which, okay, is the first month. It shall be when the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, that is the land flowing with milk and honey, the promised land, the land that was promised to Abraham that his descendants would occupy, this land flowing with milk and honey. That, he says, bring you to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, which he swore to your fathers to give you, this land flowing with milk and honey, and you shall keep this service in this month. Verse 6, 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and on the seventh day there shall be a feast to the Lord. So here we are, the 7 days. You're to eat unleavened bread, okay? Not leavened bread that puffs up and rises and represents sin, but unleavened bread, which represents the righteousness of Christ, the righteousness that we're supposed to be having in putting in us as well as exhibiting, right? So Christ then imputes his righteousness to us. And we see all these things, these symbols here. But again, this is what we need to do each year so that we remember these things. And this is what we're doing today. We're recalling what it was that God did and why he did these things. Verse 7, unleavened bread shall be eaten 7 days, and no leavened bread shall be seen among you. You got to get rid of it. Nor shall leaven be seen among you in all your quarters, so out of the house. Why? Well, verse 8, you shall tell your son in that day, this is done because of what the Lord did for me when I came up from Egypt. It shall be a sign to you on your hand and as a memorial between your eyes, that the Lord's law may be in your mouth. For with a strong hand the Lord has brought you out of Egypt, out of sin. This was supposed to be something that they were to remember, and it was to be, again, represented or seen or reflected in their acts. So what we do with their hands, okay, and this memorial between the eyes, to bring to remembrance this every year so that you would not forget that it is by God's strength that we come out of sin, okay, that he works with us. Okay, we have our part to do, okay, but it is completely because of God that we can do it. In verse 10, you shall therefore keep this ordinance in its season from year to year. So again, we see this, okay, that it was not by our might or by our power, but it was because of what God did for them and for what God does for us today. So it is by Christ in us, it is by God's strength that we are delivered. So continuing on in verse 14, again, it repeats this. So it shall be when your son asks you in the time to come, saying, what is this that you shall say to him? By strength of hand, the Lord brought us out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. I mean, they had been relegated to being slaves, even though their numbers were great. they did not have the will or the fortitude or the strength to save themselves. It was God who did this. Okay. It was God's strength then that we see is the key integral factor in them being able to leave Egypt, to come out of Egypt. And this was to be their sign. Now, once God began, as we saw already, them to start this journey out, they plundered the Egyptians for basically payment. And to a certain degree, I imagine it depleted them of a lot of their wealth. As we see, God is working out something here too. God, whenever he's doing things, sometimes we may only see one thing and we may be happy with ourselves that we understand the one thing that God is doing at that point in time that we see. But often God's juggling more than just one ball here, and he's got several things that he's working on. And we'll see the other thing that he ends up doing here as well. But what we're going to see here is then the Israelites then in this subsequent 7 days, there was a walk that they needed to walk. They needed to walk forward in faith. So they came out of sin, but they needed to continue their journey towards the promised land in faith. So continuing in verse 17, then it came to pass when Pharaoh had let the people go that God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near, for God said, lest perhaps the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. So what we're seeing here then is that there was a way, okay, and from what I understand from some of the commentaries, it's a very well-traveled and established way to go from A to B. But God says, okay, no, we're not going to go that way. And he gives them perhaps a little clue here as to why. He says, okay, we're going to do this. But little did they know what was waiting also for them. But the point is that they needed to continue to follow God. The God who freed them was just the first step. He was the God that was going to lead them, was then what they needed to learn. So God led the people around by the way of the wilderness to the Red Sea, and the children of Israel went up orderly in ranks out of the land of Egypt. And what a sight that must have been, because there was 600,000 men, and it has often been estimated to be at least 2.5 million of the Israelites. That's basically your 4-man family, your man, your wife, and the 2 kids. It could have well truly been more than that, but we're estimating it, and that would have been an incredible sight to see for sure. But they went out orderly. In verse 19, and Moses took the bones of Joseph, for he had placed the children of Israel under solemn oath. God will surely visit you, and you shall carry my bones and from here with you. So again, we're going back to this promise that Joseph knew about that was made to Abraham. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons. Joseph was the youngest until Benjamin came afterwards. But then he knew what was going on. He knew that these things were going to happen and that God would promise to take them, because he knew God would fulfill his promises, to the promised land. And Egypt was surely not that. So they took their journey from Succoth to Etham at the edge of the wilderness, and the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so as to go by day and night. So here we have then God leading. Okay, he was this pillar of cloud and pillar of fire. All the Israelites had to do was follow in faith, to walk in faith, to trust and believe that God who had saved them could then lead them to where they needed to go. Again, for us, in hindsight, 2020, we're looking back and going, oh, how simple and easy that should have been and must have been. And yet, they didn't allow God to completely direct their steps. They did not believe that God was completely directing their steps. Chapter 14, in verse 1, It says, "Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel that they turn and camp before Pi Hahiroth, between Migdal and the sea, opposite Baal Zephon. You shall camp before it by the sea." So here we have, it takes this other turn. And if you've ever looked at the topography or the geography of that part in their actual Exodus, that from leaving the center of Egypt, the heart and core of it, they went between these two mountains, right? High enough to restrict them, and they came up against the sea. So as it were, they were boxed in. And that's when Pharaoh said in verse 3, "They are bewildered by the land, and the wilderness has closed them in. Then I will harden Pharaoh's heart so that they will pursue them, and I will gain honor over Pharaoh and over all his army." So God is, again, orchestrating things. Okay, this is what we're talking about. Okay, juggling more than one ball. Okay, because God is saying, hey, he's saying Pharaoh, he's allowing Pharaoh to see and to get this idea that, okay, maybe this wasn't such a good idea to let them go. And that I'm not going to, believe that, that the God can continue to be their God and continue to be their strength, continue to lead them. And so he says, okay, I'm going to go after them. And because of this, God says, I'll gain honor over Pharaoh and over all his army, that the Egyptians may know that I am the Lord. And they did so. So here we have then God having other plans for Egypt, for Pharaoh, for their army, which was ostensibly the greatest army at that time that the world knew. And this powerhouse that was able to subdue this many Israelites. So now it was told the king of Egypt that the people had fled. The heart of Pharaoh and his servants was turned against the people. And they said, why have we done this? Why have we let Israel go from serving us? So he made his chariot ready, and he took his people, his army, with him. And he took 600 choice chariots, all the chariots of Egypt, with captains over every one of them, the entire army of chariots. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the children of Israel. And the children of Israel went out with boldness, so the Egyptians pursued them. All the horses and the chariots of Pharaoh, his horsemen and his army, overtook them, camping by the seaside, okay, where we were talking about, between the mountains and up against the Red Sea. And when Pharaoh drew near, the children of Israel lifted their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them. So they were very afraid, and the children of Israel cried out to the Lord. Again, I don't think that we can condemn them for being this way, for being this physical people who had been subjugated to the Egyptians for so long, who had been their slaves, who had to do everything that they said, and had this, again, long-term view of the Egyptians. And now here they were having these miracles done for them. They're being let out before they know it. And they're going here, and this doesn't seem like the best of moves. So they were following the light, the cloud and the fire. But did they have the faith that they needed? Verse 11, we see that no, they didn't. Then they said to Moses, because there were no graves in Egypt, have you taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you dealt with us? Why have you so dealt with us to bring us up out of Egypt? Is not the word that we told you in Egypt? So it wasn't the first time they said stuff like this, saying, let us alone that we may serve the Egyptians, for it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. Again, it's not a completely unreasonable question, but it was because of a lack of faith. It was because they didn't understand what God was doing. They didn't completely know who God was. They did not completely believe who he was, that he had the power to deliver them. And this is what we're going to see now. that we come to the culmination of the days of unleavened bread. So historically, we've understood that it was on this last day of unleavened bread, this holy day, that the Israelites were to cross the Red Sea, and that they would see then the ability of God, the power of God, and the power that God has to deliver them and subsequently to deliver us. So continuing on in verse 13, Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand still." All you have to do is just remain right here. Just watch what's going to happen. "And see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall see again no more forever." All right, so now we come to what's going on here. Now they're let in a little bit more on what's happening. Okay, why did God turn them and lead them to here? Well, again, to build their faith, right? But he also was working towards ending the Egyptian empire and having these people as enemies, having this world power that could also be somebody to be one of their menaces. So he says, watch what the Lord will accomplish here for today. The Lord, verse 14, will fight for you, and you shall hold your peace. Again, this is God's promise to us today even, and has always been his promise to the people of Israel, that he would fight their fight, that they didn't have to go to war. Now, they got in a different mindset. They wanted to fight. They wanted to have a king over them, and they made these wrong decisions, and God would have to go on and fulfill his promises anyway that he had already made to Abraham. Again, God's capable of doing that. He's capable of accomplishing several things at once. But here he's telling them, he's letting them know that he will fight their fight. They need to have faith in him that he will do that. And they were lacking that faith. Even though they were following him and walking, they did not truly believe. Verse 15, and the Lord said to Moses, "Why do you cry to me? Tell the children of Israel to go forward, but lift up your rod and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it. And the children of Israel shall go on dry ground through the midst of the sea. And I indeed will harden the hearts of the Egyptians, and they shall follow them. So I will gain honor over Pharaoh and over all his army, his chariots, and his horsemen." So the Israelites were said, okay, now you have to go. And I think it's here that they actually had to demonstrate a certain amount of faith. Because we'll see that when the Pharaoh and the chariots went through, that they thought they could go through, but they would sink down. And so here we have these walls of water on both sides. And you're going, okay, by faith, I'm going to have to just step out onto this ground. And they went over as though it were dry ground. They didn't sink into the mud. And they were able to cross all the way over this Red Sea. And who knows what was kind of going through their mind, but they still at least had to step out in faith. So they're exhibiting finally some faith here. Okay, well, whenever this comes down to it, you got Pharaoh one way and you got the other way. And so it's like, okay, well, the better option here then is to trust God. So continuing on in verse 18, then the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I have gained honor for myself over Pharaoh and his chariots and his horsemen. And the angel of God who went before the camp of Israel moved and went behind them. And the pillar of cloud went from before them and stood behind them. And so, again, providing this buffer, this barrier, this protection that was afforded to the people of Israel until they could get across, until they could substantially get to the other side. So it came between the camp of the Egyptians and the camp of Israel. Thus it was a cloud and darkness to the one, and it gave light by night to the other, so that the one did not come near, and the other all that night. And then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind. And all that night made the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. So the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea on the dry ground, and the waters that were a wall to them to their right and to their left. And the Egyptians pursued and went after them into the midst of the sea, all of Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. And I think we're all familiar with this story. But then it came to pass in the morning watch that the Lord looked down upon the army of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and cloud, and he troubled the army of the Egyptians. And he took off their chariot wheels so that they drove them with difficulty. And the Egyptians said, "Let us flee from the face of Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians." That would have been a good idea. But, continue on in verse 26, the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea that the waters may come back upon the Egyptians, on their chariots, on their horsemen." So then they were made ineffectual. And then now they're in the middle of the Red Sea. And when the morning appeared, the sea returned to its full depth, and the Egyptians were fleeing into it. So the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. God took care of their problems. God delivered them out of the hand of the Egyptians. He also made the Egyptians no longer a problem to the Israelites. So verse 30, the Lord saved Israel that day out of the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. It was God who saved them. It was God who delivered them. It was God who brought them fully out of the land of Egypt. It said that this Red Sea represented the border, as it were, to the Egyptian empire at the time. And God, on this last day of unleavened bread, did this miracle and saved them, gave them salvation, delivered them out of the land of Egypt, out of Egypt, which represented sin, out of Pharaoh, and from under his onerous type of hand that he ruled them with. And he gave them salvation, as it were. Not by their strength, but by his. But because they walked in faith across the Red Sea. And they did this little part that they had to do. Because they did this, verse 31, Israel saw the great work which the Lord had done in Egypt. So then they feared the Lord and believed the Lord and his servant Moses. So after 7 days, which is a symbol of completeness, they were completely delivered, okay, and out of Egypt, complete. You know, the word 7 in Hebrew comes from this word that means to be complete. And that's why we see 7 so often. But now we're seeing that this is what God's plan was all along. Now they didn't know, but again, they were supposed to have faith in God. They had seen the power of God. Right? Now they should, but they had a heart in them that was not the way it should be. Nonetheless, you know, Hebrews 11 in verse 29, it says, by faith they passed through the Red Sea by dry land, whereas the Egyptians attempting to do so were drowned. So they did finally exhibit some faith, and because that, God was able to deliver them. But it doesn't end there. This is a process. Again, we are being saved. God is continuing to remain in our life. By his strength, we are to move forward, to walk into faith. But we need to continue to do our part. The Israelites wanted to return to Egypt. They wanted to return, as it were, to those sinful ways. You know, they were supposed to purge sin out of their lives, and they were supposed to be prepared to move forward. They were at that one point, but they wanted to return to it because of a lack of faith and a lack of understanding. And the problem was, because of the heart that they had, that they would continue to be the physical people that they were. And they did not continue to walk in faith. And because of this, they were not going to be allowed to go into the promised land. Those who were adults whenever they left the land of Egypt. Numbers 14 verses 29 through 38. Again, it kind of recounts this story of what happened and why this was to be. And God pronounced a pretty harsh judgment on them. Harsh by our standards, I'm sure. But God, who has the power of life and death, knows what he's doing. But he says, the carcasses of you who have complained against me shall fall in the wilderness. All of you who were numbered according to your entire number, from 20 years old and above. So those of you who left, again, the age of majority, this adult age, except for Caleb the son of Jephunneh and Joshua the son of Nun, you shall by no means enter the land which I swore I would make you dwell in. Okay, he swore that to Abraham, that his descendants would be in there. But he says, but your little ones, whom you said would be victims, I will bring in. They shall know the land which you have despised. So the ones that were under 20, okay, God would say, okay, yes, I'm going to continue to fulfill my promises to Abraham. But as for you, your carcasses shall fall in the wilderness, and your sons shall be shepherds in the wilderness 40 years, and bear the brunt of your infidelity until the carcasses are consumed in the wilderness. So according to the number of the days in which you spied out the land, 40 days, for each day you shall bear your guilt 1 year, namely 40 years, you shall know my rejection. So the people had the representatives that were to go and spy out the land. And they came back with this evil report, all of them except for Joshua and Caleb. But the people believed this. Okay, they fell for it. They followed it. They did not continue to believe God, to walk into faith, to know that God would deliver. They said, and they went and looked at the people of the land and said, oh, look, we're like grasshoppers in their eyes. They can just squish us with their feet if they wanted to. And they lacked that faith that God said that they needed to have, that God showed them that they should have, that God continued to deliver them and do miracles around them. He says, no, but because you've done this, I want you to think about that. So they thought about it until they died in the wilderness. But the young ones also had that time to think about it as well. And so they saw these things. And hopefully they began to learn a little bit about that, about the way that they needed to be. That they should have listened to God and they should have continued to follow his word. And they did do a little bit better job of this under Joshua. Let's turn to Joshua 1 and verse 7. And Joshua took over the reins after Moses. Moses was not allowed to go into the promised land either, because again, if you recall, he hit the rock which was Jesus. He was supposed to speak to it, to have the water come out, but he hit it, and he should never have done that. And when you understand that the rock was Jesus, how egregious was that, to hit the rock? Even because, the people were acting up, and perhaps Moses may have had, quote unquote, the right to be a little bit indignant about the way the people were acting. He did not have the right to do what he did. And so because of that, he went up and he was able to see the promised land from afar, but he was not able to enter the promised land after all that he had done, because he didn't listen to God. Joshua 1 and verse 7, it says, only be strong and very courageous, that you may observe to do according to all the law which Moses my servant commanded you. Okay? This is what the people were supposed to do before. They were supposed to do according to all the law. And now Joshua is being reminded. You do according to all the law which Moses my servant commanded. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, that you may prosper wherever you go. He's saying, stay on this straight and narrow way. Don't veer to the left or right, lest you fall off into trouble or to some precipice or dangers that may lurk. It's a very narrow way. Go straight forward. And it's all is going to be well with you if you do that. So moving forward then to verse 5, or chapter 5, sorry, verse 4, we see now almost this kind of duplication 40 years later of what has already transpired, what we started off with in Exodus 12, that they had gone through, the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, and those who were 20 and older when they came out of Egypt now have died. And we pick up the story with the fact that they hadn't been listening to Moses and what Moses had commanded, what God had given through Moses. There were God's laws. Moses was this intermediate figure who was going to deliver it. God was working with Moses and gave it to them. And one of the things was that they were supposed to be circumcised. And so we find Joshua 5 and verse 4, and this is the reason why Joshua circumcised them. All the people who came out of Egypt who were males, all the men of war, had died in the wilderness on the way after they had come out of Egypt. For all the people who had come out had been circumcised, right, so that they could take the Passover and go through the days of unleavened bread. But all the people born in the wilderness on the way, as they came out of Egypt, had not been circumcised. For the children of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness till all the people who were men of war who came out of Egypt were consumed because they did not obey the voice of the Lord, to whom the Lord swore that he would not show them the land which the Lord had sworn to their fathers that he would give to us, a land flowing with milk and honey. And so they did not do this. So here they had to be circumcised. Why? Because they're coming into now towards the land of milk and honey, the land of Canaan, the promised land, and it's coming up on Passover. We see this in verse 10. And to be able to take Passover, they had to be circumcised, and they all were. And then they had spent some time healing, and so now they camped at Gilgal and kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month at twilight on the plains of Jericho. And then they ate of the produce of the land on the day after Passover, unleavened bread, parched grain, on the very same day. So here we are 40 years later on this day, that they left out of Egypt. So now what we're going to see here is that now that unleavened bread has began, that there's going to be this other event that transpires. And we pick up the story here in chapter 6 and verse 1. It says, now Jericho was securely shut up because, the people of Jericho had heard what God had done even 40 years before in bringing the Israelites out of Egypt, and they had reason to be concerned. And the Lord said to Joshua, verse 2, see, I have given Jericho into your hand, its king, and the mighty men of valor. God is calling it as it is. He's telling them this is what it is. It's as good as done. All you have to do is have faith. So he says, you shall march around the city, all you men of war, and you shall go all around the city once. And you shall do this for 6 days. So here we have the Passover, and then we have them saying, you need to march around the city for 6 days. And then on the 7th day, you're going to march around it 7 times in verse 4. And then it shall come to pass that you blow the trumpets, the priests are going to have them, and then all the people are going to shout, and that the wall will fall down flat, and the people shall go in, every man straight before him. So God's calling this as it were. He's telling them, this is what you have to do. And then on the 7th day, that is today, this last day of unleavened bread, you do this, and it will be yours. God will deliver this to you. He will save you from having to die. He will give you the land that it was promised to you. All you have to do is stand still and watch, as it were, the salvation. All you had to do is follow what God was saying. And it's not going to be done by your strength, but it's going to be done by mine, by God's strength. And God will make it so. And so, of course, they did that. And did exactly as it were. And we see in verse 16 he said to the people, shout, for the Lord has given you the city. So before the city is even there, Joshua counted it as sure. By faith, he knew it was going to happen. And Hebrews 11:30 says, by faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they encircled it for 7 days. So the people then did their part. Not a big part. All you got to do is walk and blow and shout, and that's it. That's all God required. Then God did the rest. God delivered the city into their hands. He delivered the land of Canaan, the land flowing with milk and honey, into their hands. They didn't have to do much, but they did have to do what God asked, whether they understood it or not. Then they saw it afterwards. God does the same for us today in all these ways. God has delivered us out of sin and out of slavery. Romans 6, verses 15 through 18. This is why this is important to us today. We see these things. We see how God works. We see and we learn our lessons. We need to take them. We need to live by them. We need to inculcate them. We need to make them a part of us. Romans 6, verse 15 says, what then, this is Paul speaking, shall we sin because we are not under law but under grace? Certainly not. So yeah, we are still under the law, but we are also under grace as well. But just because we are, it does not mean that we can sin, which is breaking the law. That's what sin is. It's whatever God says is the law, whether we understand it or not. If we don't do it, that is sin to us. And he's saying that, no, we cannot sin. All right, why? Verse 16. Do you not know that to whom you present yourselves slaves to obey, you are that one's slaves whom you obey? Right? So if you obey the law, it's one thing. If you don't obey the law, you are obeying sin. Okay, and you are a slave then to sin, just as the Israelites were in Egypt. They were slaves in Egypt, which represented sin. They did not have their own volition to do whatever it was that they wanted to do until God intervened. So he says, whether of sin leading to death, you can be a slave to it, and it leads to death, or of obedience leading to righteousness. Right? Had they stayed in Egypt, or if they'd been part of the Egyptians, right, they would have gone the way of the Egyptians, which were to be no more. They were completely destroyed. Verse 17, but God be thanked that though you were slaves of sin, yet you obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine to which you were delivered. So God has given us this opportunity. He has given us a calling. He's called us out of sin, out of Egypt, out of this present evil age, out of the world, to not be a part of the ways of the world and what it has to offer. Right? To which we were enslaved. We were enslaved. We were captors, a part of that. But God is the one that has delivered us. He has made us. He's given us, again, how is it that we are part of this, of spiritual Israel? It's because God has given us this opportunity to have a circumcision of the heart. You can look at the end of chapter 2 of Romans. Okay, saying that, yes, we become this spiritual Jew, this spiritual Israelite, when we have this circumcision of the heart in the spirit. Okay, so we have that heart that God has given to us, which enables us to be delivered out of sin. And then verse 18, and having been set free from sin, having been delivered from sin, having been saved from sin, just as the Israelites had been saved, you became slaves of righteousness. Okay, that's what we're going to obey. That's what God wants us to do. That's God's way, not our way. And because we do that, ultimately, if you want to turn over a couple of chapters, we see what the end of that is. Being slaves of righteousness. Romans 8, verses 18 through 21. He says, look, I consider the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. Right? There are things that we do have to go to. There is a walk. There are detours. Okay? But we follow God where he leads us. And we know that the end of it is going to be worthwhile. For the earnest expectation, the creation eagerly waits for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope, because the creation itself also will be delivered from bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. We are bound in this body that degrades over time, that becomes corrupt in this way and goes back into the ground out of which we came. But that's a temporary thing that Paul is saying. And we don't have to be completely subjected to it, because there's this glorious liberty, this freedom, where God will deliver us from this bondage that we're in, from this world literally, in the physical that has a hold on us, to where we can become a part of his family and be children of God. But that's not going to happen by our might. It's only going to happen through the power of God in us, as we then submit to it. As long as we allow God to guide us, to steer us. Right? I mean, what's Proverbs 16:9 say? It says, man's heart plans his own ways, but it's the Lord that we look to direct our steps. We are to continue to walk by faith. Right? What 2 Corinthians 5:7. For we walk by faith, not by sight. Go through Hebrews 11. In fact, let's just turn over there real quick. Hebrews 11, verses 1 and 2. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Okay? The Israelites didn't know that God was going to part the Red Sea. How could they have possibly known? Nobody's ever seen anything like this before. And yet, we have to have faith and trust in God. For it by the elders obtained, our ancestors, obtained a good testimony. Those who, again, the writer of Hebrews goes on to delineate to a greater degree. Again, we know what God can do. Okay, that's why we walk by faith. We don't look at the mountains on either side of us and the sea before us and the Egyptian army coming the other way. And I guarantee you there's going to be a time coming when we're going to have to pass a very similar type of test of faith. Is our heart going to pound out of our bodies, or are we going to be sure that we're going to see the salvation of God as he delivers us yet again, even in a physical way in the future? We need to look at these things as though they have been done, as though they are as good as done. Just like the Israelites when they looked at Jericho, and God says, I will deliver this city to you that seems impenetrable. Verse 39 of Hebrews 11. And all these things, and all these people, having obtained a good testimony through faith, they didn't receive the promise. We don't have the promise. A lot of people that we know still haven't obtained the promise, and they have died having not received it. Just as Abraham. He even lived in that area. And he didn't put down roots because he looked towards the real promise of the coming of the kingdom of God and the family of God, to be a part of that, the true purpose that we're looking towards. Because God, having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. So God was working to perfect them as he is working to perfect us. Let's continue in the next chapter as we continue the thoughts here. It says, therefore, we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witness, okay, of those before us, we've seen the faithful back then, and we see some of the faithful now. So it says, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us. There is sin. There is, by default, that wants to hold us, grab us, bring us, pull us down. And that's what we've been picturing throughout these days of unleavened bread, is putting sin out of our lives, but putting righteousness in, the righteousness of God through Christ, through the power of his Spirit. Okay? So knowing this, God says, continue to walk in faith. Continue to use my strength. You're not going to do it by your own might. And if you do that, I will deliver. So run that race with endurance, the one that's set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. Just as he began at Passover, the night to be much observed, the first day of unleavened bread, he was the author of that plan to bring the people of Israel out of Egypt. And he completed that. He brought them out of Egypt. He saved them. He delivered them by bringing them through the Red Sea on the last day of unleavened bread. He delivered them the promised land, right? After they walked in, and they walked by faith around the city of Jericho throughout the days of unleavened bread, having faith that God would deliver, and he did once again on the last day of unleavened bread. God is showing us the same thing, that he began a good work in us, and he's going to complete it. Okay, that's what these 7 days represent. They're a symbol of completeness. Okay, so he's going to complete the work that he began in us until the day that Jesus Christ returns. That's what it means here in Hebrews 12 and verse 2, that he is the author and the finisher of our faith. He's the one that began it. He's going to continue all the way through, delivering us all along the way, all the times that we need to, all the way to the very end. So we need to make sure then that we do not walk by our own might or by sight, but by God's strength, walking in faith, knowing that if we endure to the very end, that God will indeed deliver us